In World War I, Canada had one black battalion, just one. They cut the roads, built the railways, powered the camps, and when the medals were handed out, their name wasn't even spoken. This is the story of the battalion that helped win a war and got nothing in return. Their story begins with a silence, not the silence of peace, but the silence that follows a question no one wants to answer. Why were these men forgotten? For decades, their name barely appeared in classrooms, documentaries, or parades. Their contributions were scattered across dusty archives, hidden behind the louder stories of white regiments who received the glory they themselves were denied. And yet, without these black soldiers, the war machine Canada depended on would have collapsed long before victory. To understand how this erasure happened, we have to rewind to the years before the battalion even existed. The world was at war. Young men across Canada rushed to enlist, driven by duty, patriotism, and the promise of equality. But for black Canadians, that promise was a lie long before they reached the recruitment office doors. They were turned away with excuses meant to sound official but dripping with prejudice. This is not your war. Your service is not required. White units will not serve beside you. Still, they kept trying. They believed wearing the uniform would prove something. That loyalty could outweigh skin color. That courage could earn respect. But each rejection reminded them that the battlefield was not the only place they would have to fight. Even as the war demanded more bodies, the country demanded they stay out of sight. Eventually, public pressure made it impossible for the government to ignore them. Black communities organized meetings, wrote letters, pushed newspapers, and demanded answers. Their message was simple. If our sons are good enough to die for this country, they are good enough to serve in it. After months of debate, Canada finally relented, not by integrating black soldiers into existing units, but by creating a segregated battalion, the No. 2 Construction Battalion. The formation of this battalion was not a gift. It was a compromise rooted in racism. While white soldiers trained for combat, these men were assigned the exhausting, dangerous work that kept the entire army functioning. Their tools were axes, saws, shovels, and raw endurance. Their mission was to build the infrastructure others depended on. They were the backbone of an army that refused to stand beside them. Yet when they finally deployed overseas, they carried themselves with a pride no prejudice could break. They knew their work would save lives. They knew their labor would push the war effort forward. They knew that even if white officers doubted them, the battlefield would reveal the truth. Canada needed them. But when the war ended, the truth was buried. While white regiments marched in victory parades, these men returned to a home that refused to acknowledge what they had done. Their names were not recorded in speeches. Their battalion was not honored in ceremonies. Their sacrifices were folded into silence, as if history hoped the memory of their service would fade away. It almost did. For nearly a century, their story lived only in fragments, in family memories, in fading photographs, in whispered pride passed down through generations. Most Canadians never learned about them. Many who did dismissed them as a footnote, not realizing that the roads their armies marched on, the railways that carried their supplies, and the camps that sheltered their troops existed because of these black soldiers who were told they didn't belong. This silence is where our journey begins, because you cannot understand the battalion's impact until you understand the weight they carried even before stepping onto the battlefield. Their fight was not just against an enemy overseas. It was against a nation that needed their strength but refused their equality. And yet, they answered the call anyway. Their story continues with a truth that still stings today. These men had to fight just to be allowed to serve. After the war ended, history tried to silence their contribution. But before the battalion ever set foot in France, the country they hoped to defend tried to shut the door on them entirely. Their battle for recognition didn't begin overseas. It began the moment they approached a recruiting office. When young black Canadians first volunteered, many believed enlistment would finally prove something about their worth. They saw the war as a chance to stand shoulder to shoulder with white soldiers, to show courage where it counted, to claim a piece of national identity from which they had always been excluded. But racist gatekeepers made sure that dream never materialized. Recruiting officers dismissed them, mocked them, or simply refused to process their applications. Some said black men wouldn't survive the climate overseas. Others claimed white soldiers would refuse to fight beside them. None of the excuses were rooted in truth. They were rooted in fear, ignorance, and a system built to keep black people out of public life. Still, these men didn't walk away. They kept showing up. Every rejection strengthened their determination. They understood something that the system could not imagine, that loyalty does not depend on acceptance. Even without equality, they were willing to risk their lives for the future of the very nation that denied them dignity. As the war intensified, the reality of mounting casualties forced politicians to reconsider their stance. The military needed manpower, but even then, they refused to allow black soldiers into white infantry units. Instead, officials decided on a different kind of solution, a segregated battalion that would keep black men separate while still exploiting their labor. It was not equality, it was not respect, but it was a foot in the door, and black communities across Canada seized the moment. Churches, community leaders, and families gathered to encourage enlistment. They understood that if the battalion succeeded, it could shift the future for generations of black Canadians. For many families, sending a son into the military became a statement. We are part of this nation, even if this nation pretends we are not. Hundreds answered the call. They enlisted with pride, even knowing the system viewed them as inferior. As the battalion formed, it became clear that segregation went far deeper than separation on paper. White officers were placed in command, even when black men with experience were available. Some white officers refused their assignments, unwilling to be associated with a black unit. Training facilities were inadequate, resources were scarce, and the battalion faced scrutiny from critics who believed it would fail before it even began. But the men who filled its ranks refused to collapse under the weight of prejudice. They carried themselves with discipline and dignity that often surpassed that of the units surrounding them. Their presence challenged the nation's assumptions. Newspapers debated whether the battalion should exist. Politicians argued over what roles black men were fit to perform. Through all of it, these soldiers trained with a quiet focus, determined to prove that their worth was not up for negotiation. They didn't seek approval. They sought the opportunity to serve. Every step they took toward deployment was a small victory over a system designed to exclude them. Their uniforms, though worn under the shadow of segregation, symbolized a deeper truth. They belonged in the military narrative just as much as any white regiment. They had earned their place through persistence alone. As they prepared to leave Canada, many believed this would be their moment to redefine how the nation saw them. The war would test their strength, but it would also reveal their unbreakable resolve. They fought for entry, they fought for recognition, and soon they would fight for the army that spent years denying their humanity. When the battalion finally left Canada, many of the men believed the hardest part was behind them. They had fought against rejection, prejudice, and institutional barriers just to put on the uniform. But the reality waiting for them overseas revealed that their struggle was only changing shape, not ending. They had dreamed of combat roles, of proving themselves under fire, of earning honor the same way white soldiers did. Instead, they were handed shovels, saws, axes, and orders to perform the labor the army considered beneath its fighting units. Their deployment took them first to England, where they were stationed near large military camps. Even there, the same patterns followed them. White units avoided them. Officers doubted them. Their responsibilities revolved around physical labor, heavy, constant, back-breaking work that never received praise. But they performed it with the same discipline and pride as any frontline regiment. They knew the war depended on infrastructure. They knew their work mattered, even when others refused to admit it. Soon after, they were sent to France, where their mission intensified. The environment was harsh, the conditions brutal. Forest after forest had to be cut to provide timber for trenches, bunkers, and railway ties. Rail lines needed to be extended to keep ammunition, food, and equipment flowing to the front. Roads had to be built and repaired so artillery and supply convoys could move without sinking into the mud. These tasks were not glamorous, but they were essential. Without them, the army simply could not operate. The men worked in freezing rain, scorching heat, and thick smoke from burned wood. They cut trees until their arms trembled, hauled logs through knee-deep mud, laid tracks beneath constant pressure to deliver. Their days started before sunrise and often stretched late into the night. Exhaustion became a constant companion, but so did determination. They understood their purpose, to keep the machinery of war moving forward. And yet, despite their contribution, they were constantly reminded of their segregated status. White soldiers sometimes mocked them, others ignored them, but occasionally there were moments of quiet respect, moments when their sheer endurance forced acknowledgement. A unit that was never expected to succeed began outperforming expectations. Officers noted their reliability, their work ethic, their discipline. Slowly, the narrative began to shift. Even those who had doubted them were forced to see that these men were not merely laborers. They were soldiers fulfilling a mission the army desperately needed. The battalion's work sites were often near danger zones. Artillery fire shook the ground. Enemy aircraft buzzed overhead. Though they were not frontline fighters, they lived within the reach of war's violence. Some were injured, some died, but their sacrifices went largely unrecorded. When reports were written, their names rarely appeared. Their tasks were summarized in a few simple lines, hiding the human cost behind them. Through it all, a quiet sense of pride grew among the men. They spoke of building something bigger than themselves, supporting a cause that reached beyond the prejudice they faced. They believed that their dedication would eventually lead to recognition. They believed service would transform how Canada viewed black citizens. They believed hard work would carve a new future for their children. But even as they poured strength into every long shift, a painful truth followed them. The country they served did not see them as equals. Their labor was essential, yet invisible. Their sacrifices were real, yet overlooked. Their loyalty was unwavering, yet unreturned. Still, they pressed on. In the forests of France, between the sound of axes striking timber and saws cutting through wood, they built more than roads and railways. They built a legacy of resilience, a legacy of dignity, a legacy that proved no amount of discrimination could weaken their resolve. When the war finally ended, the men believed their service had earned them a place in the nation's memory. They had cut the timber that held the trenches together, built the railways that fed the front, and kept the supply lines alive under the worst conditions. They had given everything a soldier could give: strength, loyalty, and in some cases their lives. But when they returned home, they discovered that victory did not erase prejudice. It only made its absence more visible. While white regiments marched through crowded streets to the sound of applause, the battalion received no invitation to join. Cities organized parades, erected banners, and welcomed home their heroes. Speeches praised courage, sacrifice, and national pride, but the names of black soldiers were left unspoken. They watched from sidewalks, unnoticed, as celebrations swept past them. In the nation they had helped defend, they remained invisible. The silence that met their return was not accidental. It reflected a deeper belief held by those in power, that black men were tools of labor, not citizens to be honored. Their accomplishments were deemed unworthy of public recognition. Their contributions were buried beneath reports that reduced months of relentless effort to a few vague sentences. Files that should have held their stories were incomplete, scattered, or ignored. They were not seen as heroes. They were not even seen as equals. For many soldiers, the transition back to civilian life was bitter. They returned to the same discrimination they had left behind. Jobs were scarce, and employers rarely hired black veterans. Benefits granted to white soldiers were denied or delayed. Some faced open hostility for daring to wear their uniforms in public. It was as if their service meant nothing the moment they stepped off the ship. Families tried to honor them privately, keeping memories alive in homes where their uniforms and badges became cherished symbols of pride. But on a national level, their existence faded. Textbooks never mentioned them. Museums overlooked them. Documentaries focused on battles fought by men who received medals, while the builders of those battlefields were forgotten. And yet, the battalion did not simply disappear. Its legacy survived in the communities that refused to let the story die. Descendants told and retold the history. Local historians dug through archives searching for clues, letters, and photographs. Church elders passed down accounts of sons, brothers, and fathers who served despite a nation that rejected them. Quietly, the truth endured. But truth alone was not enough. The country needed to confront what it had done, and for decades, that confrontation never came. Governments avoided the topic. Military leaders ignored it. Even as social movements pushed Canada to acknowledge its racist past, the battalion remained largely unknown outside the communities tied to its story. In classrooms, students learned about great battles and famous generals, never knowing that thousands of hours of unseen labor by black soldiers made those victories possible. The soldiers themselves aged, their memories becoming fragile. Many died without hearing a single public acknowledgement of their service. Their stories slipped into silence as the last surviving members carried their history in fading voices. The nation they once fought for seemed content to let time erase them entirely. But the silence was never complete. There were always people listening, families, researchers, activists, waiting for the moment when the country would finally be ready to face its own neglect. Their persistence would eventually spark a national reckoning. But before that reckoning arrived, the battalion spent nearly a century in the shadows. Their absence from parades, history books, and public memory was not just an oversight. It was a statement. It said that service alone was not enough for black soldiers to be considered worthy of honor. It said that a nation could benefit from their labor while refusing to share its gratitude. It said that the fight for recognition would last long after the war had ended. For decades, the battalion lived only in fragments, stories whispered at family tables, photographs tucked into drawers, names carved into memory but not into monuments. Their legacy could have disappeared entirely if not for the people who refused to let silence win. The country ignored them, but their descendants did not. And slowly, that quiet determination began to change everything. Researchers dug through military archives searching for any trace of these men. Historians pieced together documents that had been overlooked for generations. Community activists traveled across provinces collecting testimonies, letters, and stories from families who still carried the weight of the past. Each discovery pushed the truth closer to the surface. The battalion that Canada tried to forget was becoming impossible to ignore. The shift began in small ways: articles in local newspapers, conversations in classrooms, public talks in community halls. The more people learned, the more they realized how deeply injustice had shaped this chapter of history. It wasn't just a matter of omission. It was a deliberate erasure of black soldiers whose contributions had kept an entire army functioning. The narrative of the war simply didn't make sense without them. As awareness grew, pressure mounted on the government to acknowledge the harm done. This was no longer a forgotten story. It was a moral test. And after nearly a century of silence, Canada finally responded. Officials began reviewing historical records and meeting with families of the soldiers. Historians were consulted. Communities were invited to share their stories publicly. The truth that had been buried for decades was now shaping national conversation. Then came a moment many believed would never arrive: an official apology. In 2022, the Canadian government formally recognized the racism and discrimination that had denied these men the honor they deserved. Leaders admitted that the battalion had been treated unjustly, that their contributions had been minimized, and that the country had failed to respect the soldiers who helped support its wartime efforts. For the families, it was a bittersweet moment. The apology could not return the lost years, the denied opportunities, or the silence that stole their ancestors' recognition. But it was a beginning, an acknowledgement that truth matters, even when it arrives a century late. Monuments were commissioned, exhibits were created. The battalion was officially designated a nationally historic event. Their story, once hidden, now sits at the center of discussions about race, history, and military service in Canada. Young people who had never heard of them now learn their names in classrooms. Veterans groups honor their sacrifices, and communities across the country recognize that remembering them is not just an act of history, but an act of justice. But recognition is not the end of the story. It is the responsibility of every generation to carry these names forward. The battalion served a nation that refused to see them, yet they gave everything. Their resilience shaped the Canada we know today. Their struggle exposed the racism embedded in its institutions. Their legacy proves that courage does not depend on recognition, it creates it. As we reflect on their journey, we must ask ourselves what it means to truly honor those who came before us. It means speaking their names. It means telling their stories. It means ensuring that future generations never again inherit a history with missing pages. And it means acknowledging that the fight for equality did not end with their service. It continues with us. If you believe their story deserves to be heard, then keep it alive. Share this video so others can learn the truth. Like it so the algorithm cannot bury a history that was buried once already. And subscribe for more real stories of Black soldiers whose courage changed nations, even when the world tried to erase them.